Well, welcome to the sermon time. I am excited to be able to share this message this morning, this follow-up on this two-part series of sowing. And last week we started on this two-part series of sowing. In this year of offspring, we've talked a lot about sowing and growing. You know, we talked about that there needs to be sowing or putting into something for offspring to have a chance to occur. And we know that offspring is the fruit that leads to replication. I see the people mouthing the words out there. Right. The offspring is the fruit that leads to replication. We discussed last week these potted trees, and we talked about these bare root trees. And a bare root tree, when sown into the ground, is hungry, and it spreads its roots looking for nutrients. You know, the spreading of its roots is a foundation in its strength to withstand the storms. We talked about the potted trees. And the potted trees are the trees that are confined to a space that they're planted in. And there is no ability to spread their roots outside of that confined space. Last week, we had ourselves a tradition check. How are you doing from the tradition check last week? After I preached, I felt like God was saying to me that after this message, that there were those that struggled with something that I noted. And I said, anyone who is not a member of WCF is considered a visitor. And even further into that, I said a picture of how we ought to treat a visitor is that we treat them like an unbeliever. And this was the tradition check. And the question that I have is, how do you feel when I make that reference? And I want you to note this morning that my point was not for us to determine who are believers and who are unbelievers. Last week I referenced Colossians chapter 4, 5, and 6 as how we ought to interact with all people. And what we ought to do is take direction from God on how he wants us to interact with each person uniquely. Another thing to note is that last week I talked about this aspect of visitors versus members, and we treat a visitor, a way we can treat a visitor is like an unbeliever. I didn't say these people are unbelievers. But really, my point was twofold. And the first point within this is it would be a really great way for us to determine if there was wrong tradition in us. If when we make that reference, when we talk about how we treat an unbeliever, if right away we start to feel bad about how we would treat somebody, this would be a great determination that maybe there's some wrong tradition in us. And then the second point of this twofold point was we ought to make sure we have a clear measure for how we sow into the lives of the people at WCF, whether they are a member or a visitor. Because the truth of the matter is we would sow differently into the lives of a member at WCF than we would a visitor. And we ought to. Because a member of WCF is someone who, through our sowing process, is in agreement with the mission and the purpose of WCF and is striving to grow in those areas both personally and as well to help WCF achieve the highest level of profitability possible. You know, a visitor is someone that I see as someone who's hearing from God, whether or not WCF is the place where God is calling them to be planted into, and therefore to hear from him, God, through the shepherds as they grow. Now, the thing is when we have this clear measure of who is a member and who is a visitor, we know who we can expect to do the work needed for the mission to be successful. The thing is would it be just for us to expect a visitor to do the work required of the mission of WCF? No. Now, one of the things last week I said is if you felt uncomfortable unsettled, confused, frustrated. Maybe you even felt mad about what I said. The thing is it was an indicator. It was an indicator that there may be some wrong tradition that you have to address or that you ought to address. Wrong tradition means that you may have a belief that is not right. Now, the thing is, if you felt any of those emotions or any of those things welling inside of you, those things about how we ought to treat someone who's an unbeliever, then maybe your definition for an unbeliever is different from what Jehovah's is. Or maybe you have been interacting with those without trust in God, and that's how we define an unbeliever, is somebody without trust in God. Maybe you've been interacting with them in your own strength and not through his grace. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to talk more about how to deal with the tradition in us that may be wrong. So today, I welcome you to the message for today. I love to read. And today, what I want to do is I want to help all of us. I want to help us see that there have been things sown into our lives that have taken up root and are growing to the point that they are producing offspring. Last week together, we looked at Colossians chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. We're going to look a little bit more detail at Colossians chapters 2, verse 7 this morning. And Colossians 2:7 reads this way: rooted and built up in him and established in the faith, as ye have been taught, abounding therein with thanksgiving. This word rooted means this: that which like a root springs from a root, a sprout, or a shoot. Another word that we can use for this when we say rooted, any guesses out there? You're right, offspring. See, the thing is we can have both profitable and unprofitable things that are rooted in our lives. You know, at an early age, I adopted a belief. And my belief was that reading was for girls and nerdy boys. I believed that reading was dumb. And the thing is it was certainly far less appealing than playing sports or riding my go-kart or building a fort down at Munza Williams Oak Tree. If I wanted an adventure, I would go on a real life adventure to Sullivan's Woods or down the big hill on Banville Road. Why would I read about an adventure when I could create one on my own? See, this belief grew inside of me. And as I entered my schooling years, I started to adopt things like reading is boring. I just don't like to read. I'm just not cut out to be a reader. You know, I entered high school and reading became even more of a necessity. You know, when I think about my senior year, because Ashley and I were dating, I knew she would enable me and she'd fill me in on what she had read so that I didn't even need to pick up the book. Things like pinkmonkey.com or antistudy.com became my greatest resources. They gave me the quick abridged version of whatever book it is, the Scarlet Letter, whatever. And these websites had these resources, these abridged versions on any educational book kids across America were required to read. And I have to say, Mrs. Donker, I'm sorry. I just hate reading. My junior year, I took things to the ultimate level. And I had Mr. Winkles for history class. And he required us to write a quarterly book report. This was in addition to the weekly maps that my mom colored for me. But these quarterly book reports we had to write were book reports that had to be written on books that were from different periods of history. And it was the spring quarter and the book report was due while a group of us were supposed to be on a missions trip in Mexico. And Mr. Winkles announced to us that we're going to be on this trip, that our reports needed to be handed in before we left on the trip. Well, I had a doctorate in procrastinology. And I waited until the morning we left to start thinking about writing my book report. A group of me and my friends, who will remain completely nameless for their protection, we were loading the bus early in the wee hours of the morning. We were loading the bus for our long trip south of the border. And we realized when we were loading the bus, we completely forgot about the book report. So the three of us, when I was in high school, we were referred to as the Four Amigos. One of our amigos was a very studious individual who was already completed with his book report. You know, he was good to go. But the three of us, we rushed to the computer lab at 4 a.m. And we began the writing process. The bus was scheduled to leave at 5 a.m. The problem is I had not read a book. Another problem was that I had not even selected a book. So how do you complete a book report in 1 hour without ever selecting a book? Now, those of you that are in school, especially David and Jacob, I do not condone what I'm about to share with you. Well, how do you complete a book report in 1 hour without selecting the book? It's very simple. You make up a completely fake book title, and you make up a completely fake author, and you get to writing. I will say, though, there was such a release when I finished that report minutes before 5 a.m., and I slid that book report under Mr. Winkle's door. I didn't even have to finish the book report like my counterpart did with a paragraph of, "Thank you so much for this opportunity to write this book report," just to hit the minimum word count. This release was incredible. But the tension came when weeks later, we were sitting in Mr. Winkle's class, and Mr. Winkle's was passing out the graded book reports. Talk about tension. Mr. Gibson, I heard him call out my name. He kind of half folded the report and he passed it down the row that I was sitting in. And see, there's something that you need to understand about how Mr. Winkle's would hand back things, because the half fold was kind of reserved for those not so great grades. And it was really meant to save the student from the embarrassment as it passed down the row. I was so nervous to open up the report and to peel to the back page and view my grade. Always written in red ink and some type of note alongside of it. As I opened my book report and I started leafing through the pages, I heard one of my buddies next to me, who was an accomplice. He whispered to me, "Dude, I got a B+." Now, the thing is we had used the same technique for writing our report. So to his amazement, he had beaten the system. I'm telling you right now, the odds were not looking good for me. What are the chances that both of us beat the system? Well, I stared at the bottom of the last page and I swallowed so deep. It was like I needed a drink of water. You know those swallows when it feels like you're just swallowing just a knot of sunflower seeds? I gulped and I looked at the grade. I got an A+. And I got this glowing review. I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. At first, I felt awful for what I had done, but that feeling was like 2 seconds. And my feeling of feeling awful quickly faded to excitement, because I made this connection in my brain. My hate for reading was okay because I could beat the system. I realize now that I had created offspring, the fruit that leads to replication. See, the entire scheme was my idea. I had replicated myself in my friends, all because of a belief that reading was dumb. You know, funny, this week I was reading in John chapter 9. Talk about an amazing chapter. I feel like the events that took place in John chapter 9 are written almost especially for WCF, as we help people see the truth to free them from the tradition that has hurt them. Long story short about John chapter 9, Jesus heals this blind guy, right? And this blind guy has been blind since birth. But the religious leaders, they can't and they won't believe it. They even try to find evidence that would make the claim false. They go and interview all these people, trying to find out, was this guy really blind? Was he blind since birth? They just wouldn't believe it. Now, these so-called leaders say that the man who was previously blind was healed by a sinner. And when I looked up this word in John 9, sinner here means wicked or one who is devoted to sin. This is what they were projecting on Jesus. Why was it that they were so intent on projecting this on Jesus and couldn't believe the fact that this guy was healed? Well, the reason that they were so ticked off and upset is it was because the man was healed on the Sabbath. Tradition, or the law, or like we've covered before, the lesser system, caused these men to lose their minds. They completely missed the amazing miracle performed that ultimately glorified the God that they were supposed to represent. They couldn't get past the fact that their law was broken. And they had a wall keeping them from experiencing the fullness of God in that moment. Last week, I had a weekly meeting with Pastor Joel on a video call. And we were making some small talk, and we were talking about he and Jack, and they were reading these books together. And Joel was sharing with all this excitement about how great these books were. And I'm like, okay, this is so boring. And then he asked me one of my least favorite questions. Hey, have you read this book? And I went, no, haven't read that one. Hey, how about this book? Have you read this book? No. And he had this comment back to me with what seemed just this utter disappointment. And really what it was doing was, I don't think he realized how he was confronting me, but it was such an amazing benefit. My response to him as he was asking all these questions was, I hate reading. And after the call, I felt so convicted. But like I said, it felt so good. When I had mulled over the words that I had said, I hate reading, I hated immediately the sound of that phrase. And what I realized quickly, that it was tradition in me, it was a wrong belief in me that was causing me to feel sick. I decided in that very moment that I needed to uproot this wrong tradition in my life, and I needed to change my beliefs. One of the books that we were talking about was The Outsiders. And so I immediately downloaded the book that Jack and Joel had just finished. And in a matter of 3 days, I read the book, and now I'm on to my next one. And this is a new challenge for me. I love to read. Now, when I say that, it still doesn't seem natural. But I'm going through this process to change my belief, and it will take me some time. I know this area in my life, reading, is an area that I have some bad beliefs. And it makes me ponder, what other areas in my life do I have where I have wrong beliefs? What areas do I maybe have some bad tradition? For me, I want to be able to sow differently into people's lives, especially in an area like reading, or really any area for that matter. And the thing is that was no more evident than this week. when Macy crawled up into bed with me and she told along a book that she had never seen before. And Macy opened up the pages and began to read the words written there before me, sounding out the words and making connections. Oh, she was so proud of herself. And so was I. I affirmed her like crazy. It was almost as if God was giving me this opportunity to sow into her life and right the wrongs from my past. And that's how I want to replicate. Your offspring opportunity for this week is this. Question one of your beliefs. This is an opportunity that's all about confronting tradition in your life. Is all tradition bad? No. You also have an offspring extra credit opportunity this week. Read through John chapter 9 and read this great story about tradition and old beliefs versus new beliefs. You know, each of us have beliefs in us that were sown into us at one point. Think about an area in your life where you have a deeply held belief, something that you would not waver from, maybe something that is even unpopular with some. I can't tell you how many times I would tell people, I just don't like to read, or I hate reading, and they would look at me like I had three horns growing out of my head. As we think about these deeply held beliefs, I have some more questions for you. Does your belief create or destroy? Many of us have these traditions or wrong beliefs in us that don't create. They actually strip us of a possibility of experiencing a way in which God could be trying to reach us. How would you feel at the end of your life if you found out that there were barriers that kept you from experiencing something that God had for you? What if you found out that the only thing you needed to do to remove that barrier was to question it? I will tell you, this new challenge of embracing reading and trying to be excited about reading is not something that's going to change in a day. It's going to be a new behavior that I'm going to need to adopt and grow in. And it's something that I want to do to rewire my brain to be excited about reading. But I know that walking through the difficulty of changing that belief is going to be worth it. Because when I see what's happening in the life of Macy, and I see the joy and excitement that she's getting from finding these new words and putting them together and being able to understand the story she's reading, I see some great potential. Not only from an educational standpoint of being able to be a smart kid that can read and that can put things together and comprehend, but for her someday to be able to understand what God is trying to speak to her and the things that God is trying to show her and reveal to her. And I hope that in my home, I can create a culture and an atmosphere where my kids feel like it's comfortable to question beliefs, that it's okay to step into that tension of questioning things. And I want the same for WCF. I want us to be a place where we can question things. And it's okay for us to question beliefs, to be able to find understanding, to be able to produce more offspring, the offspring that's profitable, that leads to replication.